In the early days of the Cold War, American children sat in bright, ordinary classrooms under maps of the United States and portraits of presidents, while the most extraordinary fear of the age hung silently over their heads. They sharpened pencils, passed notes, and watched the clock, just like kids anywhere. But in the back of their minds was the knowledge that at any moment a siren could sound, a flash could appear in the sky, and a nuclear fireball might erase everything they knew in a matter of seconds. This is the story of those duck and cover generations, the kids who practiced hiding under their desks, knowing deep down that a small wooden table could not stop the power of the atom. And it is also the story of how American technology, which terrified them, simultaneously impressed the world and stunned rivals like the Soviet Union, who watched an entire society train for a war unlike anything humanity had ever seen. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, the United States lived between triumph and terror. The country had defeated Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, and its industry, science, and military power were unmatched. But in 1949, the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb. Overnight, Americans understood that the monopoly on nuclear weapons was gone. Two superpowers now held the ability to unleash destruction on a scale never seen before. Strategists in Washington looked at maps of American cities and realized that in a future war, the front lines would not be far-off beaches or distant islands. The front lines would be downtowns, suburbs, schools, and neighborhoods. Out of this new reality came a dramatic question. How do you protect tens of millions of civilians, including children, from weapons powerful enough to vaporize cities? Some people argued that you simply could not. Others believed that smart planning, civil defense, and practical training could at least reduce casualties and keep society functioning. The federal government created agencies dedicated to this mission, issuing booklets on how to survive an atomic blast, designing evacuation plans, and, crucially, turning the nation's schools into centers of nuclear preparedness. The message was simple. If a bomb falls, do not freeze, do not panic. Do something. Duck, cover, and protect yourself as best you can. At the heart of this campaign was a short film that would become one of the most famous pieces of Cold War media, Duck and Cover. In this cartoon and live-action blend, children were introduced to Bert the Turtle, a smiling animated character who pulled his shell over his head whenever danger appeared. In the film, a friendly narrator explained that just like Bert, boys and girls could protect themselves from a nuclear explosion by quickly dropping to the ground and covering their heads. The film showed kids on playgrounds, in classrooms, and even walking along sidewalks suddenly practicing this maneuver when a flash appeared. It was upbeat, catchy, and reassuring. It suggested that while the new atomic age was dangerous, it was also manageable as long as you followed instructions. But behind the cheerful animation was a world of very serious planning. In real classrooms, teachers drilled their students on exactly what to do. A bell might ring, a whistle might blow, or a teacher might shout a single word. At that signal, desks scraped across the floor as children scrambled underneath, pulling their knees to their chests, folding their bodies, and clasping their hands over the back of their necks. In some schools, children were trained to leave the classroom and move quickly into interior hallways, away from windows, where they would kneel against the wall and cover their heads. In others, they were led to basements or sturdy interior rooms, designated as makeshift shelters. The logic behind these actions was based on what scientists and military planners had learned from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They knew that even far from the center of a blast, flying glass, collapsing ceilings, and burning debris caused horrible injuries. They understood that people who dropped to the ground and shielded themselves often survived when others who remained standing did not. In that sense, Duck and Cover was not simply a fantasy. It could make the difference between life and death on the outer edges of a blast, or in the case of a smaller bomb detonated at some distance. Americans were being taught in a practical way that rapid reaction could save lives. Still, children are not engineers, and their minds work in emotional images. Many of them had seen photographs of Hiroshima's ruins, charred buildings, twisted steel, and the eerie shadows burned into stone. They had heard adults talk about the bomb in hushed tones. Some had nightmares about blinding flashes and mushroom clouds. When a teacher told them to hide under a desk, they could not help but imagine that desk standing alone in a sea of fire. Even at 8, 9, or 10 years old, many understood that if their city took a direct hit, a thin piece of wood would not be enough. In that gap between official reassurance and private understanding, a powerful mix of emotions grew. Some kids treated the drills like a game. They enjoyed the sudden burst of action, the race to get into position faster than their classmates, the nervous giggles under the desks. Others felt a deep sense of dread. They lay curled up on the classroom floor, staring at the underside of the desk above them, and quietly wondered whether this was what their last moments on Earth would feel like. The teacher's calm voice and the practice runs could not completely erase the knowledge that the weapon they were training for could level entire cities in the blink of an eye. The Cold War itself kept feeding that anxiety. News headlines talked about mutual assured destruction and first strike capabilities. Families watched reports of Soviet missile tests on black and white televisions in their living rooms. During crises, like the showdown over missiles in Cuba, the tension rose to almost unbearable levels. Some children remember watching their parents whispering over the radio or television, hearing phrases like blockade, nuclear war, and World War III. They would go to school the next day, sit through math or spelling lessons, and then drop to the floor for another drill, feeling like the world would end before they graduated. Yet it was not all helplessness. In many American cities and suburbs, parents put their confidence in technology and planning as well. Engineers designed fallout shelters. Construction companies advertised bomb shelter installations in backyards and basements. City governments mapped out evacuation routes and labeled sturdy public buildings as nuclear shelters. There was a sense that just as American industry had built aircraft carriers, bombers, and tanks faster than the enemy in World War II, American know-how could now build structures and systems to withstand at least some of the horrors of nuclear war. For Soviet observers, this was astonishing. They knew that the United States had invented and used the first atomic bombs. They saw the American nuclear arsenal rapidly expanding, soon including hydrogen bombs vastly more powerful than the ones dropped on Japan. But beyond weapons, they also saw a society mobilizing at every level. Films, booklets, and drills transformed nuclear war from an abstract strategic concept into a daily reality in the lives of ordinary citizens. In their own way, American children doing duck and cover were part of an enormous national machine of preparedness and resilience. To Soviet planners, this demonstrated not only American technological power, but also an incredible ability to organize a free, open society around a shared fear and a shared plan. From an American perspective today, there's a strange blend of pride and unease in this history. Pride because those drills were part of a broader story of American scientific and organizational strength. The same country that created nuclear weapons also produced radar networks, early warning systems, hardened bunkers, and detailed civil defense plans. Its scientists studied blast patterns, fallout, and medical effects in order to improve survival odds. Its teachers and principals were expected to act as the front line of civilian protection, turning schools into micro-fortresses of preparedness. For many viewers, this is reminiscent of how Americans outproduced and outplanned their enemies in World War II, overwhelming them with a combination of technology and discipline. At the same time, there is fascination in the personal side of the story. What did it feel like to be a 7-year-old in 1958, sitting in a cheerful classroom decorated with drawings and flags, and hearing an adult calmly explain what to do when an atomic bomb explodes? What went through a teenager's mind when he was told that if he heard the warning siren, he had to kneel in a hallway and cover his head, knowing that somewhere above him, warheads sat on top of rockets aimed at American cities? These are the questions that bring history to life, the questions that make viewers lean forward and imagine themselves in that time. Researchers who later studied those generations found that the emotional impact of growing up under the shadow of the mushroom cloud was real. Many young people reported feeling that the future was uncertain in a way their parents had never known. Some said they doubted they would ever reach adulthood, that global destruction seemed like a real possibility rather than a remote nightmare. Others channeled their fear into activism, joining peace marches or writing to politicians. Some used humor, making grim jokes about what duck and cover really meant, a kind of dark comedy that helped them cope with the stress. Not everyone was traumatized. Some children, especially younger ones, accepted the drills as just another school routine, along with fire drills and lining up for recess. For them, duck and cover blurred into a general idea that adults were in charge and had a plan for any disaster, whether it was a tornado, an earthquake, or a nuclear blast. But even for those who did not feel intense anxiety at the time, the memory of those drills often stayed with them, resurfacing years later as a symbol of the era. Over time, the cultural meaning of duck and cover changed. In the 1950s, it was promoted as serious, responsible, and patriotic. By the 1970s and 1980s, when a new generation looked back, it began to be portrayed as naive or absurd. Documentaries and satirical films replayed the Bert the Turtle cartoon with a tone of irony, highlighting the gulf between the cheerful animation and the reality of planetary destruction. For many Americans, these images became a shorthand for the strange mix of optimism and fear that defined the early Cold War. But beneath the satire, there is still a deeper message about what those drills say regarding American power and American society. They show a nation that believed profoundly in the ability of planning, training, and technology to solve even existential problems. They also show how completely the nuclear age had captured the imagination of the country, right down to the level of elementary school lessons. While Soviet citizens heard about nuclear weapons primarily through tightly controlled state media, American children saw them discussed openly in classrooms, comic books, newsreels, and television. The United States turned the bomb into a subject of public education and mass culture, something that could be taught, practiced for, and, in some sense, psychologically managed. This openness was itself part of America's technological and cultural strength. It reflected a confidence that the country could not only build the most advanced weapons, but also integrate their existence into everyday life without collapsing into chaos. Soviet leaders knew that to compete with that kind of power, they needed to match not just the hardware, but also the mindset, the ability to mobilize resources, inform citizens, and maintain cohesion under the constant pressure of possible annihilation. The sight of American schoolchildren calmly practicing for nuclear attack rather than panicking sent a clear message: this society was preparing to endure. For American viewers today, many of whom never heard an air raid siren except in movies, the story of duck and cover drills invites both respect and questioning. Respect for the teachers who had to guide frightened children through something they themselves barely understood. Respect for the scientists who tried, however imperfectly, to turn data from Hiroshima and test sites into practical advice for survival. Respect for the ordinary families who built shelters, stocked supplies, and kept going to work and school, living their lives in the shadow of weapons that could destroy entire countries. At the same time, it raises hard questions about fear, propaganda, and responsibility. Were those drills genuinely about saving lives, or were they partly about convincing citizens that nuclear war was survivable and therefore politically acceptable? Did the promise that you can protect yourself help people feel safer, or did it simply place the burden of an impossible threat onto the shoulders of children and their parents? These questions cannot be answered with easy slogans, but they are part of what makes the topic so compelling. In the end, the story of Duck and Cover is the story of a superpower grappling with the consequences of its own technological genius. American science had opened the door to the nuclear age, and with that came both unmatched strategic strength and a constant gnawing fear of annihilation. In response, the country turned its schools into training grounds for survival, teaching even the youngest citizens how to react to a blinding flash in the sky. The Soviets watched, impressed, and alarmed as a rival not only built the most powerful weapons in history, but also taught its children to live with them. For the kids who crouched under desks in dimly lit classrooms, those drills were moments of confusion, fear, and sometimes bored repetition. For historians looking back, they are a window into how the United States turned Cold War technology into daily routine. And for American viewers today, they are a reminder that behind the grand strategies and missile counts of the Cold War were millions of small human experiences. The scrape of a chair, the whisper of a teacher saying, "Get down," and the quiet heartbeat of a child wondering if this was all really going to help when the sky turned white. That is the legacy of the Duck and Cover generation. They grew up in a world where American technology had split the atom, thrilled and terrified the planet, and forced every rival, especially the Soviet Union, to take the United States seriously as the unmatched leader of a new kind of warfare. Their drills were a daily rehearsal for a disaster that never came, but those rehearsals left a mark on their memories and on the nation's story. In their fear, resilience, and everyday courage, we see how a superpower's technological edge reached all the way down to the smallest desks in the smallest classrooms, shaping how a generation of Americans learned to live under the shadow of the bomb.